Welcome, weary traveler, through the passages of time. As the moon hangs heavy in the sky and the world grows quiet, I invite you to step with me into the pages of history. Settle in, get cozy, and let my voice carry you into the realm of dreams as we explore a captivating yet challenging chapter of Japan's feudal past. Before we begin our journey, I'd love to know who I have the pleasure of speaking to tonight. Whether you're nestled under the covers ready for sleep or simply seeking a moment of calm, go ahead and leave a comment sharing where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. If you enjoy immersing yourself in history as a way to unwind, consider subscribing so you never miss one of these relaxing excursions through time. Now, make yourself comfortable as we prepare to peek behind the curtain of an era long past. Tonight, we'll be exploring the often difficult and constrained lives of women in feudal Japan. But don't worry, I'll be right here to guide you gently through this unfamiliar world. No matter how harsh the realities we uncover, my soothing narration will ensure you can simply lie back, listen, and let your imagination roam free as we begin. I want you to picture yourself as a woman living in 14th century Japan. It's hard for the modern mind to grasp just how different life was then, especially for women. With nearly every aspect of their lives tightly controlled by societal expectations, women had very little personal freedom or self-determination. From birth until death, their path was largely laid out for them, shaped by forces far beyond their control. Over the course of our time together tonight, we're going to follow in the footsteps of a typical woman as she navigates each stage of feudal Japanese life, starting from her birth and childhood, through adolescence and marriage into motherhood and adult family life, and finally to her twilight years. We'll see the world through her eyes. Along the way, we'll meet some remarkable real-life women who found ways to make their mark on history, despite the incredible limitations placed on them. As you burrow deeper under the covers and feel sleep start to tug at the edges of your consciousness, let's take our first steps into feudal Japan. Breathe in deeply. Breathe out slowly and let the sounds of the present fade into the background. The only voice in your head now is mine. And the only place we are is the Japan of 600 years ago. Birth and childhood. The unwanted daughter, our story begins with a birth, but not one that is celebrated with much fanfare. For you see, in this time and place, baby girls were simply not as valued as baby boys. Families anxiously awaited the arrival of a son to carry on the family name and inherit the family estate and duties. A daughter was seen as a temporary presence, someone who would one day leave to join her husband's family. She could not continue the family lineage in the same way. At best, a girl might help with household chores until she married, but she wasn't considered a true permanent part of her birth family. In some cases, if a family already had several daughters, a newborn girl might even be a source of disappointment and burden. Although the practice was becoming less common by the feudal period, the ending of infant girls' lives did still occasionally happen in desperate circumstances. Baby girls were sometimes seen as just another mouth to feed until they could be married off. And not all families had the resources or desire to provide for them. Callous as that may sound to our modern ears, so let's imagine that by good fortune, your family chooses to keep and raise you, their infant daughter. Even from your earliest days, the expectations placed on you are clear. As you grow from a baby into a young girl, your family focuses on raising you to be subservient, obedient, humble, and skilled in domestic arts. Playing with dolls is encouraged, as it's seen as practice for one day. Caring for a family of your own, watching and helping the women of the household with cleaning, cooking, sewing, and other chores is also an important part of your girlhood. Very rarely would a girl be educated in the same way as her brothers. Most girls of the samurai class might learn to read and write at a basic level and might be taught traditional arts like calligraphy, flower arranging, or playing musical instruments. But the idea of a robust education, including classic literature, philosophy, government, and martial arts, was almost exclusively reserved for boys. A girl's education was about becoming a proper wife and mother, not an intellectual or warrior. However, even in these restrictive times, there were always some remarkable women who defied convention. One famous example from a few centuries before the feudal period we're focusing on is the author Lady Murasaki. Born into a noble family in the late 900s, Murasaki was given an unusually thorough education by her father, who saw great intelligence in his young daughter. She grew up to become a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court and penned the enduring masterpiece. The Tale of Genji, considered by many to be the world's first true novel, as a young girl in feudal times. Murasaki's story may have been told to you as an exceptional legend, a near mythical example of what women were capable of under extraordinary circumstances. But you would know that her path was the exception, not the rule. However much innate talent or ambition you might possess, your destiny is to be a wife and mother with little room for personal pursuits. And so the years of your girlhood slip away, spent close by your mother's side, learning and preparing for your inevitable future. Your world is small, just your family home, and perhaps occasional outings to a temple or market. But soon enough, usually around the age of 13 to 16, your world will suddenly expand, though not in a way of your own choosing. The arranged marriage, a life not your own, for you see, the time has now come for your parents to arrange your marriage. This isn't a love match. Romance has little to do with marriages in feudal Japan. Instead, your parents are looking at social position, political allegiances, and how best to strengthen the family through your match. If you're lucky, your husband will be close to your own age rather than decades older. You may have met him a few times, or he may be a total stranger. Your wishes in the matter are, of course, irrelevant. You're informed of your parents' choice and begin preparing to leave the only home you've ever known to join your husband's household. You'll be living with his parents and any siblings, becoming the lowest-ranking woman in a new family. It's a daunting prospect, but as a proper feudal Japanese girl, you've been raised to be submissive and obedient. To question or resist the path laid out for you would be unthinkable. As you gather your belongings and prepare to depart from your childhood, let's pause and consider another real young woman who made this fateful journey. The Lady Tokumhame was born into a powerful samurai family in 1607. At the tender age of 15, she was married off to the son of the reigning shogun. Tokum suddenly found herself thrust into the very highest echelons of feudal power and intrigue. But Tokuhame's marriage was more than just an alliance between noble families. It was a political necessity. For you see, her young husband was already being groomed to one day take over rulership while Japan as the next shogun. This meant that Tokuhame was under immense pressure to cement her place in the dynasty by producing an heir, a male heir. Of course, without a son to one day inherit the shogunate, her husband's family would fall from power, and Tokuhame herself would lose any status and security. So, as Tokuhame departed her family home as little more than a child herself, she carried the weight of dynastic ambitions on her slim shoulders. The expectations that she quickly conceive a son were just the start of a lifetime of intense duty and scrutiny in her new role. Her major purpose in life, like every woman in her time, was to bear children. We'll explore the often harrowing realities of feudal Japanese motherhood more deeply in just a little while. But first, we turn back to you, our protagonist. As you take your first steps into marriage and away from the relative familiarity and comfort of your childhood, dressed in your finest kimono, you take your place beside your new husband, bowing low to your new in-laws. Your old life is over now. Your role is to serve your husband's household. Your childhood home, your family, even your birth name will fade into memory. Life as a new bride. Serving the household as a new bride, you're expected to quickly learn the ways of your husband's household. His mother is now your main taskmaster, critic, and teacher. She shows you how she likes the meals prepared, the correct way to wash and mend the family's clothes, the proper rituals for honoring the household's ancestors. Make a mistake or show any hint of homesickness or resistance, and your mother-in-law will quickly scold you. You must embody the ideal of the good wife. Humble, gentle, obedient, and above all, fertile. For that is the real measure of your worth in this new role. The children you'll bear, specifically the sons. You're likely to become pregnant within the first year of marriage, as your husband will visit your bed frequently. Contraception is virtually non-existent, and you have no real right to refuse your husband's advances. Your body is now largely under his and his family's command. As your belly grows heavy with your first child, you continue your daily chores as a young wife for as long as you can. Hopefully, your mother-in-law will show you some kindness as your pregnancy advances, perhaps allowing you to rest a bit more or eat a little extra food. But pregnancy is not considered an illness or a handicap. You're still expected to fulfill your household duties as a woman for as long as possible. Let's turn again briefly from your story to consider another real woman who exemplified the life of the typical feudal Japanese wife. A generation or two before your time, there lived a woman named Fumiko. Born into a poor peasant family in the early 1600s, Fumiko married a local rice farmer as a teenager and immediately set to work alongside him in the paddies, up to her knees in mud, even as her children grew inside her. Over the years, Fumiko bore 6 children for her husband, working in the fields before and after each birth. As a peasant woman, she didn't have the luxury of focusing solely on the home like samurai or noble-class wives. No, Fumiko and her husband just barely eked out a living farming their small plot of land. So her help with the backbreaking labor was crucial. 2 of her babies died in infancy, not uncommon for the time. The exhaustion and poor nutrition that were part of the peasant lifestyle made pregnancy and childbirth even more risky. And so Fumiko soldiered on like most women of her era, sacrificing her own health and comfort for the sake of her husband and surviving children. She had no other real choice or alternative path available to her from sun up to sundown. She worked either out in the fields or inside preparing food, mending clothes, and trying to stretch what little they had to keep the family alive. Hers was a lifetime of harsh subsistence and endless toil. The dangers of childbirth back now to you. Our protagonist, hopefully born into a slightly higher class than Fumiko, but still bound by many of the same wifely expectations. As your pregnancy progresses and your delivery day approaches, you say extra prayers to Shinto spirits and Buddhist deities to protect you and your baby in the dangers of childbirth. You've heard enough whispered stories of women in your family and community dying in the process to know the risks. When your pains begin, you retreat to a special birthing room in your house, aided by a midwife and perhaps a few other experienced women. You labor bravely but with trepidation. There's no real medical knowledge of the childbirth process in your time. So if complications arise, there's little to be done. No doctors, no hospitals, none of the interventions that could save you or your baby if things go wrong. All you can do is grit your teeth, push when directed, and hope for the best. To your immense relief, you deliver a squalling infant after many grueling hours. And to your even greater fortune and delight, the midwife announces that you've delivered a healthy baby boy on your first try. You know that your husband and in-laws will be overjoyed at the news. In their eyes and the eyes of society, you've just proven your worth as a woman and wife. A son to carry on the family name is the greatest gift you could give your husband's household. In the coming days, as you recover from the physical trauma of childbirth, you pour your energy into nourishing and doting on your precious son. As a samurai-class wife, you're spared from returning to work immediately, instead expected to focus on the baby's care. You nurse your son, swaddle him tight, sing him lullabies, and shower him with affection. Your husband, too, takes great joy in this new heir. If you had instead delivered a daughter, of course, the family would still welcome her, but the celebrations would be a bit more muted. As you now well know, a daughter will one day leave the family to marry, while your son will stay and inherit his father's role and status. You will raise your daughter with love. Yes, but also with the knowledge that you're grooming her for a life of service to her future husband, just like your mother did for you. But we don't have to dwell on that bittersweet thought, for your story includes the birth of a cherished son, raising the next generation, as he grows from a helpless infant into a rambunctious toddler and young boy. You take great pride in caring for and shaping him. It's your duty to instill in him the virtues of your samurai class: loyalty, courage, honor, discipline. Your husband handles his formal education and martial arts training, but you're always there in the background as the loving, patient, ever-attendant mother. As your son grows, so too does your family. You give birth 4 more times over the next decade. 2 more sons and 2 daughters. Each pregnancy and delivery is as nerve-wracking as the first, but you feel more confidence in your role as a mother now. You delegate household chores to your daughters as soon as they're old enough, training them to be proper wives one day, just like your mother-in-law did for you. And so the years pass and your children grow. Your role is still primarily in the home, focused on your offspring and keeping domestic affairs running smoothly. When your husband is away at battle or for official duties, you're in charge of the household, making sure bills are paid, servants are managed, and the family wants for nothing. You take pride in your efficiency and capability in this sphere. In a few ways, your life is easier than a woman of a lower class in your era. You don't have to do hard physical labor, and you have servants to handle some menial tasks. But in many ways, the life of a samurai wife is still just as restricted and circumscribed. While a peasant woman might work alongside her husband and have slightly more say in their shared life, a samurai wife is still subservient and separate from her husband's world of politics and war. The rigid class system. All of these class differences would have been strictly regulated by law in your feudal era. Japan's class system was rigidly enforced, with rules around what each tier could wear, eat, and even how they could style their hair. As a samurai woman, you could be punished for wearing silk reserved for the nobility, for example. And a peasant woman could be harshly disciplined for putting on airs above her station. There was very little mobility between the classes, but even within the samurai class, women were second-class citizens compared to men. Sure, samurai women enjoyed a more refined lifestyle than women of lower classes, but they were still subject to the same limitations on personal freedoms, legal rights, and education. A peasant woman and a samurai woman alike could not travel freely, own property, choose their own husband, or pursue interests outside of the approved wifely arts. There were, however, always some exceptional women who managed to break the mold of the stereotypical passive samurai wife. One famous example was Lady Seiko, who lived about a century before our feudal protagonist's time. Seiko was married to the first Kamakura shogun and was renowned for her intelligence, bravery, and political acumen. Unlike most samurai wives who stayed meekly in the background, Seiko was a key advisor to her husband, weighing in on matters of state and strategy. She was a skilled archer and even joined him on military campaigns. After his death, Seiko maneuvered her family into power, making decisions in her son's name and thwarting attempted coups against her clan. While she was eventually forced to become a Buddhist nun in her later years, She continued wielding influence from the convent until her death, but Seiko's level of education and involvement in politics and warfare was incredibly rare for a woman of her time. She was able to make her mark on history in part because of her unusually high status as wife of the shogun and her force of personality that refused to stay confined solely to the domestic sphere. Her story would have certainly been known to later generations of samurai women like yourself. A tantalizing glimmer of what more your life could be if only society allowed it. But alas, for the vast majority of women in feudal Japan, Seiko's path was an impossible dream. Your own path, while perhaps stable and comfortable compared to a peasant woman, is still a narrow and predetermined one. Your value comes from your role as a wife and mother within your husband's household, not from any individual talent, ambition, or interests of your own. The peasant woman's burden so. Let's return again to your tale, shall we? The years have flown by, and your eldest son is now a young man of 16, almost fully grown. Your two younger boys are not far behind, both strong and healthy. Life as a peasant woman in feudal Japan was one of unceasing toil, with precious few comforts or respites. From before dawn until after dusk, the work of maintaining a household and contributing to the family's livelihood occupied nearly every waking moment. For Fumiko, the day began in darkness as she rose from her pallet on the dirt floor. Careful not to wake her snoring husband and the younger children still curled up asleep, she stirred the embers in the hearth, coaxing them back to life to boil water for the morning's meager rice porridge thawed as the sky lightened to gray. She tied back her hair, dampened with sweat from the muggy morning air that promised another sweltering day in the fields. By the time her family roused and gathered around the low wooden table, Fumiko had already been up for more than an hour, tending to the myriad tasks that kept the household running, mending clothes, sweeping the packed earth, washing the dishes from the night before. The work of a peasant woman was never done. After a hasty breakfast, gulped down in silence, the men, her husband and two oldest sons, headed out to the rice paddies, the plots of land their feudal lord allowed them to till in exchange for their labor and loyalty. Although only in her mid-30s, Fumiko's face was deeply etched from years of worry and exertion. Her hands calloused and prematurely aged as a young bride. She had moved into her husband's family home, the typical fate for village girls. Her mother-in-law, a stern matriarch who ruled the household, put Fumiko immediately to work cooking, cleaning, and serving the men. But Fumiko's primary purpose, like that of all wives, was to produce children, especially sons, to inherit the family property and carry on the ancestral line. She was fortunate in that respect, having borne her husband two healthy boys within the first few years of marriage. But the births were difficult. Long labors on the bare floor of the hut with only her mother-in-law and a village midwife to help. Fumiko endured tremendous pain, leaving her with lasting effects. She considered it a small price to pay for living sons. The babies came regularly after that, every 2 years or so. With little rest between pregnancies and no respite from her daily chores, Fumiko grew thin and exhausted, aging decades in the space of a few years. 2 more boys followed, and then to her dismay, a pair of daughters. Although she cherished all her children, Fumiko knew that girls were considered a burden, another mouth to feed until they married out of the family. She quietly felt she had somehow disappointed her husband as soon as they were old enough to walk steadily. Fumiko put her daughters to work around the house and brought them out with her to the fields. Unlike her sons, who would attend a village school to learn reading and writing, Fumiko's girls would receive no education. Their futures, like their mothers, lay solely in domestic service, first to their parents and later to their husbands. It pained Fumiko to imagine such limited prospects for her bright, lively daughters, but she saw no other path for them in their rigidly structured feudal world. Daily life in the rice paddies with the younger children in tow. Fumiko spent her days bent over in the paddies alongside the men, knee-deep in the muddy water as she helped plant, weed, and harvest the rice crop that sustained them both physically and economically. There were no weekends or holidays, only a ceaseless cycle of planting and reaping, broken up by the occasional village festival or religious ceremony. Even when heavy with child, Fumiko's work continued unabated. She muffled her groans of discomfort as she crouched over the rows of rice seedlings, her belly swollen and straining against her rough cotton kimono, squinting into the harsh sun glinting off the paddies. Fumiko blinked away the sweat and tears that mingled freely on her face, feeling the child move inside her as if in protest of its constrained, laborious confinement. Thoughts of her unborn baby filled Fumiko with an overwhelming mix of emotions. Hope that it would be another healthy son to bring pride to the family. Fear of complications or a difficult birth without even rudimentary medical help. A touch of bitter resignation at the realization that her own life would be shortened by these repeated pregnancies and deliveries, an almost inevitably heavy burden in an era of high maternal mortality. As the sun gradually sank over the lush green patchwork of the rice fields, Fumiko straightened up painfully, pressing one dirt-caked hand to the small of her back, where the ache was sharpest. She gathered her daughters who had spent the day chasing away hungry birds from the grain and began the slow trudge back to the village. Empty baskets balanced precariously on her head. Behind her, Fumiko's husband and sons shouldered their tools, staring resignedly at their feet. Nobody spoke. The work itself was so exhausting that conserving energy for conversation was an unfamiliar luxury. In any case, Fumiko reflected, what was there to discuss? Their lives were circumscribed by the never-ending struggle to coax enough food from the land, to fill their bellies and pay their taxes. Season after season, year after year, with no variation or respite. Only the numb mute rituals of survival. Evening, rituals and fleeting dreams, back inside the close confines of the family's hut. Fumiko kindles the cooking fire again and begins preparing the evening meal. As the rice pot bubbles and the pickled vegetables are laid out, she assembles the entire family around the low table, deferentially serving her husband and sons first before sitting down to her own supper. In the smoky dimness, Fumiko surveys her family, the flame light flickering over their tired faces. With a stab of melancholy, she dwells for a moment on the daughter she will never know, the one she miscarried in the fields years before. Whether from the unrelenting work, the poor diet, or simply the whims of a harsh fate, nearly 1 in 3 pregnancies ended that way. But life ground on, as merciless and unyielding as the turn of the seasons. As Fumiko dips her head over her bowl, a few words of Buddhist prayer forming themselves in her mind. A sudden movement from within makes her pause. The child lives, impatient for its own entrance into the world. She rubs a hand over her distended belly, trying to soothe the restless spirit inside her. Boy or girl, samurai or peasant, its life will be molded by the same immutable forces that constrain her own. Tradition, obligation, and unrelenting labor. The feudal system grinds on, shackling each new generation to the well-worn grooves of the past. And for the women of Fumiko's village and countless others like her throughout Japan, their individual lives are subsumed in the greater imperative to bear the children, tend to home fires, and help fill the rice bowls that feed the nation. In the face of such intractable gender roles, their personal hopes and dreams are as insubstantial as wisps of smoke curling up from the cooking fire, soon extinguished. As her family finishes the meal in the customary silence, Fumiko gathers up the empty bowls with a weary sigh. The baby has settled, but the dull ache in her lower back persists, a physical manifestation of the ceaseless grind of her existence. she allows herself the briefest of fantasies, imagining for a moment a life free of the endless cycle of pregnancy and drudgery. But such thoughts are quickly banished, replaced by a surge of shame. To yearn for something beyond her prescribed role is a betrayal, an abdication of the responsibilities that have been drummed into Fumiko since birth. She is a wife, a mother, a daughter-in-law. Her own desires are irrelevant. Harmony and submission, the twin virtues of an ideal woman, have been etched into her very bones. The weight of centuries with an effort of will. Fumiko pushes herself up from the table, feeling the child shift heavily inside her. Her husband and sons have already retreated to their pallets, leaving the women to finish the cleaning up. She hands a stack of bowls to her oldest daughter, who at 9 is already well trained in the domestic arts. The girl's face is solemn as she performs her duties. No trace of youthful rebellion in her demeanor. Someday, Fumiko knows her daughter will be in her place. A baby on her back and another in her belly, her feet permanently muddied from the rice fields. It is the only future she can envision for the girl, the only one that their rigidly stratified society permits. The thought brings a pang of regret, but no real surprise. As the last embers fade in the hearth and the humid darkness presses in from all sides, Fumiko sinks down onto her thin pallet, easing her aching body into a reclining position. She stares up at the thatched roof, barely visible in the gloom. Tomorrow will be the same as today and all the days that came before. An endless cycle of planting and harvesting, washing and mending, birthing and burying. For a woman in feudal Japan, there is no respite, no escape from the narrow confines of her prescribed roles. The seasons may turn and the years may pass, but the rhythm of her life remains as unchanging as the tide. Fumiko closes her eyes, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down upon her. In the moments before sleep claims her, she sends up a silent feudal prayer, not for herself, but for the generations of women yet to come, that they may someday know a life beyond the patties and the cooking fires, a life of their own making. But such thoughts are fleeting, insubstantial as the curls of smoke that even now drift up from the banked embers and dissipate into the muggy night air. Fumiko's last conscious sensation is the flutter of the child in her womb, a reminder of her inescapable destiny. She surrenders herself to sleep, her mind already turning to the tasks that await her in the gray light of dawn. A single thread in the tapestry. This is merely a glimpse into the life of one peasant woman. A single thread in the vast tapestry of feudal Japanese society. But it is a thread that repeats itself endlessly, a pattern of unremitting toil and female subservience that persists across generations and social classes. From the lowest village to the loftiest castle, the women of this era are bound by the same rigid expectations, the same narrowly circumscribed roles. To be born female in feudal Japan was to be consigned to a life of service and sacrifice, with little hope of autonomy or self-determination. The weight of tradition and the inflexible hierarchy of the feudal system combined to create an existence of unrelenting hardship for women of all classes. Whether laboring in the fields or tending to the needs of their samurai husbands, their lives were defined by duty and submission, their individual identities subsumed by the greater imperatives of family and society. It's a stark and unforgiving portrait, a world where even the most basic rights and freedoms are denied to half the population based solely on their gender. And yet, even within these suffocating constraints, there were women who managed to carve out a measure of agency and influence, subverting the rigid norms of their society in subtle and extraordinary ways. In the noble halls of the samurai and the cloistered chambers of the imperial court, a handful of exceptional women left their mark on history, wielding power and shaping events through their intelligence, their artistry, and their sheer force of will. These are the stories that puncture the bleak tapestry of female constraint, the glimmers of light in an otherwise dark and stifling landscape. the legacy of resilience in the centuries to come. As Japan slowly emerged from its feudal past and began its halting journey towards modernity, the legacy of these remarkable women would endure, inspiring new generations to challenge the status quo and demand a better future. But for Fumiko and her countless sisters in hardship, such change would come too late. Their lives forever bound by the implacable dictates of a society that saw them as little more than property and child-bearers. As we trace the long and winding path of Japanese history, it's impossible to ignore the central role that women played in shaping its course, even as they were relegated to the margins and denied the most basic rights and freedoms. Theirs is a story of resilience and quiet determination in the face of overwhelming odds, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit in even the most constraining of circumstances. And so we leave Fumiko to her dreamless slumber, her body heavy with the weight of the unborn child and the centuries of tradition that hang upon her like a yoke. In the distance, the first faint light of dawn is already gathering on the horizon, heralding the start of another day of ceaseless toil and silent endurance. For the women of feudal Japan, it is a cycle that will repeat itself endlessly, a legacy of hardship and subjugation that echoes across the ages. But even in the face of such unrelenting adversity, their spirits endure, their stories waiting to be told. And in the telling, perhaps we can begin to shed light on the dark corners of history and honor the countless nameless women who bore the burden of their society's inequities with grace and grit. Their voices may be silenced by time and circumstance, but their experiences remain, woven inextricably into the fabric of Japan's past and present. As we drift off to sleep, the gentle rhythms of Fumiko's story washing over us like a lullaby, we carry with us a renewed appreciation for the struggles and sacrifices of the women who came before, and a deeper understanding of the forces that shaped their lives and their world. Between wakefulness and dreams, in that small quiet space between wakefulness and dreams, we can almost hear the whisper of their voices, a ghostly chorus of mothers and daughters, wives and concubines, nuns and courtesans. They speak to us across the centuries, their words a testament to the resilience and indomitable spirit of the women who lived and loved and labored in the shadow of feudal Japan. And as we finally surrendered to the embrace of sleep, our minds filled with the vivid imagery of rice paddies and cramped huts, elegant tea houses and austere temples, we carry with us the weight of their stories, a reminder of the enduring power of the human experience to transcend even the most constraining of circumstances. The women of feudal Japan may be gone, but their legacy lives on, a testament to the unbreakable bonds of sisterhood and the unyielding strength of the female spirit. And in the gentle cadence of this final thought, we drift off into the welcoming darkness, our dreams haunted by the ghostly echoes of their timeless tales. Following one woman's journey, let's imagine the journey of a woman who lived her whole life in this feudal world. What hopes and burdens did she carry through the decades? What small joys and hard realities defined her days? Our woman's story began like most in feudal Japan, with disappointment at her birth. It was the early 1500s, and her farming family already had 2 daughters. They had prayed for a son this time to inherit their meager plot of land and continue the family name. Instead, the midwife placed a small, squirming girl into the mother's exhausted arms. They named the baby Yuki and resigned themselves to raising another daughter. As in many poorer families, Yuki's childhood was short. She was too young to remember her grandmother grumbling about another mouth to feed. But Yuki grew up watching her mother's tired eyes and feeling like a burden. By age 5, she was already responsible for tending to her infant brother, the family's pride and joy. She changed his swaddling, sang him lullabies, and watched him toddle after their father in the fields with envy. The same fields were where Yuki spent most of her days. She learned to plant rice seedlings in neat rows, her back bent under the hot sun for hours. A restless and clever girl, Yuki peppered her father and grandfather with questions as they worked. Why do we grow this type of rice? How do the feudal lords decide our taxes? What lies beyond the mountains ringing their village? But her curiosity was usually met with grunts, shrugs, or rebukes to focus on her tasks. Yuki's quick mind was seen as more nuisance than asset for a peasant girl. Learning the domestic arts, it was her mother and grandmother's job to train her in the domestic arts expected of a future wife. Cooking, cleaning, sewing, weaving. Every day, Yuki watched her mother grind barley, haul water, mend clothes, and stir the pot of millet porridge over their hearth fire, a baby strapped to her back. She rarely saw her mother sit down or rest. Around age 6, Yuki started to join her sisters in these daily household chores. Their rough hands grew calluses from gripping farm tools, stirring pots, scrubbing floors. Yuki missed the freedom of running through the rice paddies with her brother and his friends, flying kites and catching crickets. Now she was learning to serve, to be as silent and efficient as her mother. The local Buddhist temple, her one refuge besides the fields, taught that women's suffering in this life was the result of punishment for misdeeds in past lives. Only male monks were allowed to study the sacred texts deeply. One of Yuki's few childhood delights was the village festival each year. She loved the colorful banners fluttering from bamboo poles, the troupe of musicians and acrobats that performed in the square. Yuk. I longed to try the drums and flutes herself or learn the graceful dances. But girls were shooed away from the male-only entertainers. Instead, she had to content herself with clapping along to the music and savoring a few bites of sweet dumplings. Those fleeting festival moments of lively energy sustained her through long days of drudgery. The arrangement as Yuki entered adolescence. Her mother began to eye her appraisingly, judging if she was ready for marriage. Yuki's belly tightened with dread when she overheard her father speaking with the village matchmaker. She knew that marriage meant leaving her family forever to join her husband's household. The very word for wife meant one who lives in another place. Yuk. I prayed she would be matched with a kind husband, not someone who would mistreat her as some men did their wives. She had no say in the matter. At 15, Yuki was informed she would be marrying the second son of a wealthier farming family 2 villages over. She met her betrothed only once before the wedding at the formal matchmaking ceremony. They knelt across from each other, sipping cups of sake and avoiding eye contact. He was a stranger to her. Yuki wondered if he too felt trapped by family obligations and dreamt of another life. The wedding passed in a blur of unfamiliar faces and a tight wedding kimono. Yuki was officially a wife now, and her only role was to serve her new family. From dawn to dusk, she was at the beck and call of her strict father-in-law and critical mother-in-law, tending to their every need. Her husband, who seemed meek and browbeaten himself, was out working the fields all day. At night, he visited her chambers to fulfill his duties. Yuki stared at the ceiling and willed her mind elsewhere. Motherhood's burdens and joys. Wasn't long before Yuki missed her monthly cycle and realized she was pregnant. When her son was born healthy and crying loudly, the family celebrated, and Yuki felt a rush of love and pride. But her mother-in-law quickly took charge, whisking the infant away to be cared for by his grandmother, as was the custom. Yuki ached for her baby as she recovered from the birth. The separation felt like losing a piece of herself. As more children followed over the years, including 3 daughters, Yuki grew to accept her lot in life. She was luckier than many women. The harvests were good. Her husband was not unkind, and they could feed their children most days. Yuki's existence revolved around serving others from sunup to sundown. She hauled water from the village well, pounded rice cakes till her arms ached, and stitched indigo-dyed cotton clothes for the family. In rare breaks, She caught up on village gossip with other wives and snuck her children sweets when the grandparents weren't looking. Yuki took solace in the little joys and rituals that marked the passing seasons: the cherry blossom picnics in spring, the star festival in summer, the harvest celebrations in fall, the New Year dishes in winter. She saved tales and wisdom to pass on to her daughters, knowing the constraints they would face in this society. They could not inherit land, learn to read, or choose their fates. But they could find meaning in small freedoms and the bonds between women. Yuki fretted over their marriages and safety as her hair grayed and her own marriage settled into companionable silence. In her 50s, Yuki was considered an old woman. She had been fortunate to survive the dangers of multiple childbirths. Now a widow, she finally held some authority in the family as a mother-in-law herself. But her body was worn out from decades of toil. Yuki's aching joints and cloudy eyes turned her attention inward. She thought often of the Pure Land, the Buddhist paradise that supposedly awaited her. Reciting prayers on her beads brought some peace. War and displacement when the clan wars reached their village, and she had to flee with her children and grandchildren. Yuki realized how fragile their lives had always been. She found herself depending on her son and grandson for survival. Now they resettled and rebuilt, replanting fields and repairing thatched roofs. Yuki did not live to see her youngest granddaughter, a bright and defiant girl, learn to write in secret from a monk who took pity on her. But she would have recognized that restless curiosity, that yearning for a bigger life. Yuki's story was one of quiet endurance through a lifetime of duty and drudgery. But it was also stitched through with moments of beauty, laughter, love, humanity shining through the hardships. She left no record of her inner world like most common women of her era. But she was a link in a chain of mothers and daughters stretching back through the centuries in feudal Japan. They bent like reeds, but were never broken. Over generations, some of these women found ways to push at the edges of their constraints. A few rebelled openly, taking up roles or shaving their heads to join monasteries. Others subverted expectations more subtly as artists and writers or merchants and innkeepers. Quietly, they shaped the consciousness of their society and passed on a legacy of resilience. Yuki could not have imagined the very different life of an ordinary Japanese woman today. One with education, careers, choices her era could not dream of. But she and all the forgotten foremothers made those futures possible through their uncelebrated fortitude. In pondering their stories, perhaps we can draw on some of that strength in our own challenging times and plant seeds of change in our turn. The river of history flows on, carrying us all in its current, and women continue to reshape it in ways big and small. The universal burden of gender life in feudal Japan was a constant struggle for survival. And this was especially true for women. While men faced their own hardships and challenges, the weight of societal expectations, rigid gender roles, and lack of personal freedoms created a particularly difficult existence for females from all walks of life. From the moment a girl was born, her life was shaped by the fact that she was seen as less valuable than a male child. Many families hoped for sons to carry on the family name and to provide for them in their old age. Daughters were often seen as a burden, just another mouth to feed until they could be married off. In some cases, if a family had too many girls, they might even resort to desperate measures. Although this practice was becoming less common by the feudal period, for the girls who did survive, their upbringing was focused on preparing them for their eventual roles as wives and mothers. From a young age, girls were taught to be subservient, obedient, and skilled in domestic tasks like cooking, cleaning, and sewing. They were expected to be soft-spoken, demure, and to always defer to the men in their lives. Rare examples of education, there were a few exceptional cases of girls who managed to get a more well-rounded education, usually because they came from wealthy or influential families. One famous example is Lady Murasaki, who lived in the late 10th and early 11th centuries. She was able to receive the kind of education normally reserved for males, studying Chinese classics and Buddhist scriptures. Murasaki went on to become a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court and wrote The Tale of Genji, considered the world's first novel and a masterpiece of Japanese literature. But for the vast majority of girls, the opportunity to learn and expand their minds was simply out of reach. As girls reached adolescence, usually around the age of 13 to 16, they were considered ready for marriage. Marriages were almost always arranged by the parents with little or no input from the young bride herself. The goal of these unions was not love or personal happiness, but rather to produce children and to strengthen the ties between two families or to forge political alliances. One poignant example is the story of Lady Tokuheim, who's married off at the tender age of 15 to the powerful feudal lord. Tokuheim was the daughter of a rival clan leader, and the marriage was arranged to bring peace between the two warring families. But for Tokuheim, it meant being torn away from her home and thrust into a new life where she was expected to bear a male heir for her husband. The pressure on young brides like Tokuheim was immense, and failure to produce a son could lead to shame, scorn, or even divorce. The wife's domain once married. A woman's life revolved around her duties as a wife and mother. She was expected to move into her husband's family home, where she had to navigate the complex web of relationships with her new in-laws. Her primary role was to bear children, particularly sons, and to raise them according to the strict social norms of the time. Women were largely confined to the domestic sphere, spending their days cooking, cleaning, sewing, and tending to the needs of their husbands and children. The challenges of motherhood in feudal Japan cannot be overstated. With limited access to medicine and proper nutrition, pregnancy and childbirth were risky endeavors. Many women faced serious complications, and infant mortality rates were high. Those who did survive often had to endure multiple pregnancies over the course of their lives, as large families were the norm. For women of the lower classes like the peasantry, motherhood was even more demanding. Not only did they have to care for their children and manage the household, but they were also expected to work alongside their husbands in the fields, planting and harvesting crops to ensure their family's survival. The story of Fumiko, a peasant woman who lived during the early Edo period, illustrates just how difficult this life could be. Fumiko bore 6 children while working tirelessly on her family's farm with little rest or respite from her daily toil. The hierarchy of hardship of course, women's experiences in feudal Japan were not uniform, and much depended on their social class and status. The rigid hierarchy of feudal society meant that there was little social mobility, and women were bound by the strict laws and customs that regulated every aspect of their lives, from the clothes they could wear to the food they could eat. Down at the bottom of the social ladder were the peasant women, who made up the vast majority of the population. They lived hard lives of manual labor, working in the fields alongside their husbands and children to grow the rice and other crops that sustained the nation. They had few comforts and little leisure time, and were often at the mercy of their local lords and samurai. Slightly above the peasantry were the merchant and artisan classes, which began to grow and thrive during the later feudal period. Women in these families might have had a little more economic security and some access to education, particularly if they were involved in the family business. But they were still subject to the same rigid gender roles and expectations as women in other classes. The samurai woman's paradox. The samurai class, the warrior elite of feudal Japan, had its own unique challenges and opportunities for women. Samurai women were expected to embody the same ideals of loyalty, honor, and self-sacrifice as their male counterparts. They were often trained in basic defense and were expected to protect their homes and families if necessary. Some samurai women became renowned for their courage, fighting bravely during conflicts. But even within the samurai class, women's lives were heavily circumscribed by their gender. They were expected to marry for the good of their family and clan, and to produce male heirs to carry on the family name. They had to navigate the complex politics of the samurai world where alliances and loyalties were constantly shifting. One powerful example of a samurai woman who rose to prominence in this world was Lady Seiko, who lived in the 13th century. Seiko was married to an important regent, and after his death she became a powerful political figure in her own right. She was known for her deep devotion to Buddhism, but also because of her shrewd political acumen. Seiko worked tirelessly behind the scenes to protect the interests of her clan and to maintain their power and influence. At the very top of the social hierarchy were the noble women, the wives and daughters of the feudal lords and the imperial family. These women lived lives of luxury and privilege with access to the finest clothes, food, and entertainment. But they were also the most tightly controlled and regulated of all the women in feudal society. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, there are always those who will fight for justice and equality, who will refuse to be silenced or marginalized. And as we look back on the lives of these women, we can also see the ways in which their struggles continue to resonate. Today, many of the attitudes and beliefs about gender that were prevalent in feudal Japan have persisted in some form or another into the modern era. Women in Japan and around the world continue to face discrimination and inequality. And the fight for gender justice is far from over. But by remembering the stories of the women who came before us, we can draw strength and inspiration from their courage and their perseverance. We can honor their memories by continuing the work that they began, by fighting for a world in which every person, regardless of their gender, is treated with dignity and respect. Imagining their lives as we come to the end of our journey through the lives of women in feudal Japan, let us take a moment to imagine ourselves in their place. Let us imagine the daily struggles and hardships they faced, the moments of joy and sorrow, the dreams and desires that they carried in their hearts. And let us remember that each of these women was a unique and valuable individual with her own story to tell and her own contribution to make to the world. Let us honor their memory by telling their stories, by keeping their legacies alive, and by working to create a world in which every woman can live a life of dignity, freedom, and fulfillment. As we've seen, the life of a woman in feudal Japan was shaped from birth by strict gender roles and societal expectations. For a girl born into a samurai family, her destiny would be tied to the fortunes and affairs of her clan. One such woman was Lady Seiko, born in 1156 into a powerful clan. As the daughter of a wealthy samurai lord, Seiko enjoyed a privileged upbringing, but also faced immense pressure to conform to the ideals of a proper samurai wife. She would become a key political player in the tumultuous world of feudal Japan. A political match. Seiko's life took a pivotal turn when at age 15, she was married off to a young shogun. It was a political match designed to form an alliance between two clans. Seiko dutifully moved into her husband's household and took on the role of a samurai wife, managing the estate, entertaining guests, and most importantly, bearing an heir to carry on the family name. As the wife of an ambitious warlord, Seiko found herself at the heart of the struggle for power in feudal Japan. When her husband established a new government system, Seiko became the most powerful woman in the nation. She embraced this role, serving as a trusted advisor to her husband and helping him govern his domain. But Seiko's true test came after her husband's sudden death. With her two young sons next in line to become shogun, Seiko fought fiercely to protect their claim against rival clans. She maneuvered her father and other male relatives into key government positions, ensuring her clan's dominance. When her eldest son proved to be an ineffectual ruler and met an untimely end, Seiko installed her younger son as a figurehead shogun, ruling in his name. For over 20 years, Seiko was the unofficial ruler of Japan, making decisions in all military and political matters. She navigated the cutthroat world of feudal power politics with skill and determination, eliminating rivals and suppressing rebellions. Power. Behind the throne, Seiko's story shows how some exceptional women could wield influence in feudal Japan, even as wives and mothers confined to the private sphere. But even a woman as powerful as Seiko couldn't escape the structures and tragedies of her time. She endured the deaths of multiple children and grandchildren, some through political intrigue. And despite her political acumen, as a woman, she always had to rule through male representatives. First her husband, then her sons died in her later years. Seiko took vows and became a Buddhist nun, as many noble women did in old age. She retired to a temple, but still continued to influence clan politics from behind the scenes until her death at age 69. Her legacy is that of a formidable woman who tenaciously seized and wielded power in a man's world, shaping the course of Japanese history. For ordinary women in feudal Japan, life was much more limited and precarious than for a noble woman like Seiko. A peasant woman's lot was one of hard labor and childbearing with few comforts or respites. Imagine a farmer's wife in a small rural village sometime in the 14th century. To give her a name, let's call her Hana. An ordinary life of extraordinary hardship. Hana likely married in her mid-teens to a husband chosen by her father. As a new bride, she would have moved into her husband's family home, becoming the lowest-ranking woman in the household. Hana's daily life revolved around an endless cycle of domestic and agricultural chores. She rose before dawn to prepare the morning meal, served her husband and in-laws first, and ate only their leftovers. She spent her days planting and weeding in the fields, tending the vegetable garden, mending clothes, cleaning, and hauling water. In the evenings, she cooked and served dinner, and might do some spinning or sewing by lamplight before bed. As taxing as this regimen was, Hana's most important duty was to bear children, especially sons, to inherit the family plot. She likely gave birth every 2 or 3 years, with a little rest from her labors. Many of her babies probably perished in infancy from malnutrition or disease. Hana herself might have died young from complications of pregnancy or the sheer physical toll of her hardships. If she survived, Hana had little to look forward to in old age, especially if she was widowed with no sons to support her. She might hope her decades of toil would earn her a slightly higher status in the household as a mother-in-law, but she would remain dependent on her male kin. Hana and millions of peasant women like her were the largely unseen and unsung bedrock of feudal Japanese society. While histories acclaimed the deeds of male samurai and shoguns, it was the grueling labor of peasant women that sustained the nation's agrarian economy. Their sacrifices and suffering were taken for granted in a social order that saw women's subordination as natural and necessary. Alternative paths, of course. Not all women in feudal Japan were wives and mothers. Some found ways to live outside of conventional family roles, even if these paths came with their own hardships. In the pleasure quarters of cities, some women worked as courtesans, entertainers, and geisha. While this profession offered more independence than marriage, it still functioned within a strict hierarchy controlled by men. Successful courtesans might wield a degree of influence by charming and advising powerful clients, but they remained vulnerable to exploitation. Other women opted for a religious life, becoming nuns in Buddhist temples. This was one of the few escapes from marriage available to women. As nuns, they could devote themselves to study and spiritual practice, and some gained respect as teachers or abbesses. However, They had to cut all ties with their families, shave their heads, and live with certain social stigmas in a society that prized fertility. A few remarkable women even made their mark in the male-dominated realm of the arts. Lady Murasaki, born around 978, became a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court and authored The Tale of Genji, considered the world's first novel. A lyrical saga of courtly life offered a rare, female perspective on the intrigues and aesthetics of the elite era. Other women made contributions in literature, poetry, calligraphy, and music. These artistic pursuits were still practiced within the constraints of court life, where women's voices were often marginalized or appropriated by men. But they testified to the indomitable creativity and intellect of women who found ways to express themselves within suffocating limitations. The tightening grip as the feudal era progressed into the Edo period. The status of women gradually became even more restricted. Confucian ideas which stressed strict gender roles and female subservience gained dominance. The ideal of the good wife, wise mother who was totally devoted to serving her husband and children, became more deeply entrenched. Paradoxically, economic growth and urbanization made life somewhat easier for many women with a bit less material deprivation. But this was offset by the Ciceros, solidifying of a patriarchal system that increasingly confined women to the narrowest of spheres and the heaviest of expectations. By the dawn of the modern era in the late 19th century, Japanese women would find themselves grappling with a legacy of subordination and limitation that was in many ways more rigid and codified than ever before. The road to greater freedoms and gender equality would be a long and arduous one, built on the resilience of generations of women who survived in a male-dominated world. So, as we ponder the incredible challenges faced by women in feudal Japan, we can take a moment to appreciate their strength, resourcefulness, and dignity in an era that granted them so little. From the unsung peasant wife to the influential noblewoman, from the cloistered nun to the expressive artist, each woman navigated the cruel constraints of her circumstances in her own way, remembering and honoring. Gilded cages, noble women were expected to be models of feminine grace and beauty, skilled in the arts of music, poetry, and calligraphy. They were rarely seen in public, spending most of their lives in the secluded inner chambers of their families' castles and estates. Their marriages were carefully arranged to forge political alliances and to ensure the continuation of the noble bloodlines. Despite the rigid constraints placed on women in feudal Japan, there were some who managed to break free of the mold and make their mark on history. These were the exceptions, the women who defied convention and found ways to express themselves and assert their agency in a society that gave them little room to do so. One such woman was Lady Okuni, a shrine attendant who lived in the early 17th century. Okuni is credited with inventing the art form known as kabuki theater, which began as a bold satirical form of dance and performance. Okuni and her troupe of female performers would dress in men's clothing and perform dances and skits that poked fun at the samurai class and the social norms of the day. Kabuki quickly became popular among the merchant and artisan classes who enjoyed its irreverent humor and bold style. Warriors. In the shadows, another remarkable woman who challenged the gender norms of her time was Lady Chiome, a noble woman who lived in the 16th century. Chiome was the wife of a powerful samurai lord, but she was also a skilled strategist in her own right. She is famous for creating an all-female group of operatives who served as intelligence gatherers for her husband's clan. These women were trained in the arts of espionage, disguise, and stealth, and they played a crucial role in gathering intelligence and carrying out covert missions. But women like Okuni and Chiome were rare exceptions in a society that placed so many restrictions on women's lives. For the vast majority of women in feudal Japan, Life was a constant struggle against the limitations placed on them by their gender and social class. Perhaps one of the most striking examples of these limitations can be seen in the legal system of feudal Japan. Women had very few legal rights and were considered to be inferior to men in almost every way. They could not own property, inherit wealth, or even choose their own spouses. They were subject to a strict code of conduct that governed every aspect of their behavior, from the way they dressed to the way they spoke. One particularly troubling example of the legal inequalities faced by women was that they could face severe consequences for perceived offenses like unfaithfulness or disobedience. Men, on the other hand, were free to take concubines and engage in extramarital affairs without fear of legal consequences. The fact that women had so few legal protections made them vulnerable to mistreatment at the hands of men. Divorce was only allowed in cases where the wife was deemed to be at fault. And even then, the process was heavily biased in favor of the husband. Women who were divorced or widowed often had no means of supporting themselves and were forced to rely on the charity of male relatives or to face dire circumstances to survive. Small glimmers of hope, despite these grim realities. There were some small glimmers of hope for women in feudal Japan. Some lords and samurai recognized the injustice of the system and took steps to protect the women under their care. One notable example was a feudal lord who ruled over a province in the 16th century. He was known for his enlightened policies towards women, which included prohibiting harsh punishments and providing education and training for girls in his domain. But these were small victories in a society that was fundamentally stacked against women. The prevailing attitudes towards gender were deeply ingrained in the culture and reinforced by the major religious and philosophical traditions of the time. Buddhism, which had been introduced to Japan in the 6th century, taught that women were inherently inferior to men and that they were more prone to certain failings. Women were seen as a hindrance to men's spiritual enlightenment, and many Buddhist texts warned against excessive attachment to women. Shinto, the native religion of Japan, also had a complex and often contradictory view of women. On the one hand, Shinto mythology celebrated powerful female deities like Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and the idea that women's bodies were sacred. But on the other hand, Shinto beliefs also perpetuated the idea that women were spiritually impure, particularly during menstruation and childbirth. Beliefs and consequences. These religious and cultural beliefs had a profound impact on the way that women were treated in feudal society. They were used to justify the strict social hierarchy and the limitations placed on women's freedoms and opportunities. And they created a culture of shame and secrecy around women's bodies and experiences. One particularly harmful example of this was the practice of ritual impurity. Women were believed to be inherently unclean, particularly during menstruation and after childbirth. They were often secluded in separate rooms or huts during these times and were forbidden from participating in religious ceremonies or entering sacred spaces. This belief in women's impurity also had practical consequences for their daily lives. Women were often banned from certain occupations, like brewing sake or preparing food for religious festivals, because of the fear that they would contaminate the products. And in some cases, women were even blamed for natural disasters or crop failures, as their perceived impurity was thought to anger the deities. Despite these deeply ingrained beliefs, there were some women in feudal Japan who found ways to challenge the status quo and to assert their spiritual authority. One such woman was an empress who lived in the 8th century. She was a devout Buddhist who used her position to promote the religion and to establish temples and nunneries throughout Japan, a legacy of compassion. This empress was particularly concerned with the welfare of women and the poor. She established a number of charity hospitals and refuges for women who were fleeing difficult marriages or who had been widowed or abandoned. She also donated large sums of money to support women who had taken vows as Buddhist nuns, and she encouraged other noble women to follow her example. But even a woman as powerful as this empress could not completely escape the limitations placed on her by her gender. She was still expected to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother, and she faced criticism and opposition from some quarters for her religious and charitable activities. The twilight years as women aged and reached the later stages of life, they faced new challenges and limitations. By the time a woman reached her 40s or 50s, she was considered to be old in feudal society, and her role changed accordingly. Many women of the peasant class who had labored hard in the fields alongside their husbands and children found themselves widowed and without support in their later years. They might have to rely on their sons or other male relatives to provide for them, or they might face destitution. Women of the merchant class who had spent their lives working in their husbands' shops and businesses often face similar challenges. If their husbands died before them, they might be left without a source of income or a means of support. Some widows were able to continue running the family business, but they often faced discrimination and obstacles from male competitors and customers. For samurai women, the later stages of life might bring a different set of challenges. Many samurai women outlived their husbands, who often died young in battle or from illness. These women were expected to maintain the family honor and to carry on the samurai legacy, even as they grieved the loss of their husbands and sons. One such woman was Lady Seiko, who wielded political power throughout her life. After the death of her husband, Seiko took vows as a Buddhist nun and retired to a temple. But she continued to be involved in the political intrigues of the time, using her influence to protect the interests of her clan. Freedom in faith. For some women, the later stages of life brought a sense of freedom and opportunity. They might become nuns or devote themselves to religious practices, finding solace and meaning in their faith. They might go on pilgrimages to holy sites or sponsor the construction of temples and shrines. But for many women, the end of life was a time of loneliness, hardship, and dependence. They had to rely on the goodwill of their male relatives or the charity of strangers to survive. And they faced the prospect of illness and infirmity without the benefit of modern medicine or care. Looking back on the lives of women in feudal Japan, it is clear that they faced incredible challenges and hardships. From the moment of their birth, they were seen as inferior to men and were denied the basic rights and freedoms that we take for granted today. They were expected to be obedient, docile, and subservient, and to put the needs of their husbands and families above their own. Exceptional spirits, and yet, despite these incredible odds, there were women who found ways to resist and to assert their agency in small and large ways. There were women who became warriors, artists, and leaders who challenged the status quo and fought for a better life for themselves and their sisters. These women were the exceptions, but they remind us of the incredible resilience and strength of the human spirit. Their stories deserve to be remembered and honored, not just as a dark chapter in history, but as a testament to the unbreakable spirit of women through the ages. Though long denied a voice of their own, the women of feudal Japan still speak to us today of the timeless struggle for autonomy, respect, and self-determination. In listening to their stories, we keep their memories alive and carry forward their legacy of resilience. And so, as we drift off to sleep, let us hold a space of contemplation for these remarkable women of a distant time and place, who endured so much hardship and yet managed to leave their indelible mark on history. May their fortitude and grace continue to inspire us in our own struggles and triumphs across the ages. Through their fortitude and resilience, Some women managed to carve out meaningful lives and even exert influence within feudal Japan's patriarchal confines. One such remarkable figure was Lady Seiko, born in 1156 to a powerful samurai family. At age 13, she was married off to a rising warlord in a political alliance typical of her class and era, as her husband's wife. Seiko was expected to serve him, bear his heirs, and dutifully manage the household. She did all this and more, quickly proving herself to be intelligent, resourceful, and politically astute. When her husband was away on military campaigns, Seiko ably governed in his stead, advising on clan strategy and even organizing defensive forces when needed. Her wisdom and competence earned her great respect as she skillfully balanced the roles of samurai wife, mother, and power behind the throne. A widow's resolve when her husband died suddenly, Seiko acted decisively to protect her clan's interests and young sons. Knowing that rivals would seize upon a widow's vulnerable position, she immediately took religious vows and became a Buddhist nun. This gave her a measure of protection and authority, from which she could wield power and fend off threats to her family. For the next 20 years, through a combination of diplomacy, intrigue, and sheer indomitable will, Seiko helped steer her clan through treacherous political currents. She brokered key alliances, outmaneuvered scheming adversaries, and secured her son's place as shogun, ruler of all Japan in name, if not always in fact. Seiko's steady hand safeguarded her family's dominance as the ruling power for generations. Yet, even the most extraordinary woman of her age could not entirely escape the trials and tragedies that marked so many female lives in feudal Japan. Of Seiko's children, only one sickly son survived to adulthood. Her relationship with him was strained as she strove to make him a strong leader against his temperament. In the end, he died young, leaving the power to more distant relatives. For all her maneuvering, Seiko could not override the era's rules on male inheritance as she entered old age. After a lifetime spent upholding her family's name, Seiko gradually withdrew from the world of earthly affairs. She retreated to a small hermitage and devoted her final years to Buddhist practice, perhaps seeking in faith the peace and refuge she had never quite found in the turbulent realm of men. The exact date of her death is uncertain, but by most accounts, she lived into her 70s. A remarkable lifespan for the time. Both stricture and possibility. Lady Seiko's story exemplifies both the strictures and the possibilities of being an elite woman in feudal Japan. Through circumstances of birth and marriage, she was thrust into the highest echelons of power. Through her own keen mind and unrelenting determination, she seized every opportunity to shape her fate and that of her clan. Yet even such an exceptionally capable, noble woman could not fully unshackle herself from the bonds of her gender. Despite all her influence in matters of state, her destiny ultimately depended on the men in her life, the husband she served, the son she fought for, the nephew who would succeed her line. For each hard-won victory, the implacable force of male dominance still delimited her course. Seiko's experience, writ large on the tapestry of history, echoes the intimate struggles of countless women who lived in those long-ago times. Whether born to high or low status, samurai or peasant, each woman had to navigate a world that offered her few choices and little control over her own fate. From cradle to grave, she was at the mercy of fathers, husbands, and sons. Her value measured by her utility to men. Perhaps there was a young peasant bride, toiling beside her husband in the rice paddies from dawn to dusk, bearing child after child until her body broke under the strain. A samurai widow fighting to preserve her late husband's meager stipend so she might feed her children. A low-ranking concubine scheming to secure her position in a noble household, lest she be cast out to fend for herself, finding meaning in constraint in ways great and small, Every woman had to find her own path through the maze of obligations and expectations that hemmed her in on all sides. Yet it would be a disservice to remember these women only as passive victims of their circumstance. Within the narrow confines of their prescribed roles, they nonetheless found ways to carve out lives of meaning and purpose. They planted rice, wove silk, and raised children. They formed friendships, fell in love, and grappled with heartache. They prayed to the gods and Buddhas, seeking solace and strength in the face of hardship in the tapestry of their daily lives, woven out of myriad small joys and sorrows. These women quietly shaped the course of history, even as it pushed them to the margins. To be a woman in feudal Japan was to inhabit a world that offered little in the way of freedom or agency. It was a world of strict hierarchies and unyielding expectations, where a woman's worth was measured by her obedience and her fertility. It was a world where even the most brilliant and ambitious woman could only wield power from behind the scenes, forever dependent on the whims of men. Yet, it was also a world where women found ways to endure and even thrive in defiance of the many forces arrayed against them. Through their resilience, their ingenuity, and their quiet strength, they left an indelible mark on the fabric of their society, even as their names and deeds were so often erased from the official record. Humanity. Across the centuries, as we look back across the centuries, it is easy to see only the oppression and injustice that constrained the lives of these long-ago women. But we must also remember their humanity, their tenacity, and their indomitable spirit in the face of adversity. In the end, their story is not just one of subjugation, but of survival, a testament to the enduring power of the human will to find meaning and beauty, even in the most unforgiving of circumstances. So let us remember the women of feudal Japan not just as victims of their time, but as the heroines of their own unsung epics. Let us honor their struggles and their triumphs, their sorrows and their joys, and let us carry their memory with us as a reminder of the indomitable resilience of the human spirit, which endures and flourishes even in the darkest of times. As we drift off to sleep, let us dream of those long-ago women who lived and loved and fought and endured in a world so different from our own, yet so achingly familiar in its essential humanity. Let us hold their stories in our hearts as a testament to the enduring strength and courage of women across the ages. And let us carry their memory with us into the dawn as a reminder that even in the face of the greatest adversity, the human spirit will always find a way to shine through. The legal reality, as the strict hierarchy of feudal Japanese society solidified over the centuries, so too did the subservient position of women become more entrenched. The highly patriarchal system left women with very few rights, protections, or opportunities for self-determination. Their legal status was barely above that of property, first under the control of their fathers, then their husbands, then their sons. From birth, girls were considered less valuable than boys. While the practice was already declining by the feudal era, desperate families sometimes made heartbreaking choices. The ideal family was thought to have 3 daughters and 5 sons. But even for girls who were welcomed into the world, a difficult path lay ahead. They were raised to be subdued, obedient, and focused on domestic duties to prepare them for marriage. Their overwhelmingly likely fate, unlike their brothers, girls didn't typically receive a formal education in reading, writing, or academic subjects. A notable exception was Lady Murasaki, who was born into a cultured clan around 973 during an earlier period. She benefited from having access to her learned father's library, where she immersed herself in Chinese classics and developed a deep love of literature and poetry. In a society where women were often discouraged from reading too much, lest they become difficult to manage, Murasaki's erudition was highly unusual. Her literary talents blossomed at court, where she served as a lady-in-waiting. During the long stretches of idle hours, Murasaki began writing the sprawling novel that would become her masterpiece. The Tale of Genji. Art as resistance, the story of a prince and his many relationships, was a witty, perceptive, thinly veiled critique of aristocratic life. Laced with over 800 exquisite poems, the 54-chapter masterpiece is considered the world's first novel and a pinnacle of classical Japanese literature. Its psychological depth, rich visual detail, and treatment of complex themes all sprang from the mind of the court lady known as Murasaki. Against the odds, she achieved a level of education that equipped her with the tools and talent to create an enduring work of art. But Murasaki's experience was the exception, not the rule, for noble women of the age, and certainly for women of lower classes, that there were few paths besides marriage available. For peasant girls, that transition might come as young as 13 or 14. Even some samurai and noble houses married off their daughters in their mid-teens to cement political alliances. Marriage was not about love, but practicality and duty. Weddings were arranged by parents with careful calculations of social rank, financial gains, and ties between extended families. The bride was expected to be virtuous, obedient, skilled in homemaking, and hopefully fertile. Imagine the trepidation a girl must have felt barely into her adolescence as she left behind the only home she'd known to start a new life with her husband's family. There she would be expected to serve her in-laws and bear as many children as possible, with immense pressure to produce a male heir swiftly. Difficulty conceiving was always seen as the woman's fault. A bride who failed to conceive a son might find herself replaced by another wife or a concubine. Consider the case of Lady Tokuheim, born into a powerful samurai family in 1607. At the tender age of 15, she was married off to an important shogun to shore up her clan's position in the new regime her father had helped establish. The burden of dynasty much was riding on young Tokuheim to ensure an heir. Fortunately, just shy of her 18th birthday, Tokuheim gave birth to a healthy boy. She would go on to bear 5 more children, cementing her place as a political force to be reckoned with. When her husband died, Tokuheim took an honorific title and became a key advisor to her son. The new shogun Dot as a formidable figure. Tokuheim wielded considerable influence behind the scenes. She issued orders, received officials, and intervened in conflicts between rival factions. When scandal threatened her son's heirs, Tokuheim acted quickly to preserve the line of succession. Her shrewd instincts and unwavering loyalty to her family made her arguably the most powerful woman in Japan at the time. But Tokuheim's place at the pinnacle of feudal society was rarefied air that vanishingly few women would ever breathe. For the vast majority, their adult lives revolved entirely around domestic duties, with little opportunity for anything beyond household drudgery and motherhood. A woman was judged almost solely on her ability to bear children, especially sons to carry on the family name. Frequent pregnancies were the norm for married women during their fertile years. But without access to modern medicine, these repeated pregnancies exacted a heavy toll. Complications from childbirth were a leading cause of death for women in feudal Japan. The average woman might expect to bear 5 or 6 children, but infant mortality rates were also high. Perhaps only half would survive to age 5. The physical and emotional strains of motherhood in this era were immense. The peasants, the double burden, the arduous reality of peasant women in particular, can hardly be overstated. In addition to their maternal role, lower-class women were expected to work alongside their husbands in the rice paddies, toiling for long hours to eke out a meager living. Their bone-weary existence left little time for rest or respite. Imagine the life of a woman like Fumiko, born into a farming family during the peaceful but rigid period of rule. From a young age, Fumiko would have been put to work feeding livestock, hauling water, weeding fields, processing crops, all on top of cooking, cleaning, sewing, and minding younger siblings. Swiftly married off to another farm family as a teenage bride. Her grueling labor would only intensify. Rising before dawn to stoke the cooking fires, Fumiko's calloused hands would prepare the morning meal for her husband and in-laws before heading out to the paddies. Knee-deep in muddy water, she'd bend double to plant, weed, and harvest the household's staple crop. Returning sore and soaked, an endless list of domestic chores still remained. Perhaps the sole respite from Fumiko's unrelenting daily grind was the communal bath at the end of the day. There she could shed her sweat-streaked clothes to sink into the warm women-only sanctuary of the neighborhood bathhouse. Amid clouds of soothing steam, the farm wives would finally find a moment to rest, gossip, and escape their cares before the cycle began anew the next morning. Year after year, through multiple pregnancies, Fumiko's sturdy peasant body would be her most valuable asset, even as it gradually wore down under the weight of ceaseless labor and childbearing. If she survived into old age, her gnarled hands and stooped back would tell the story of a lifetime of hardship all too common for women of her station. Class and constraint, but even a woman of the upper echelons could not fully escape the confines imposed upon her gender. Social class was the single greatest determinant of a woman's quality of life in feudal Japan. But strict laws regulated the privileges afforded to each stratum of society. From the cut of their kimonos to the ingredients in their kitchens, every aspect was prescribed by a woman's rank. Laws laid out in exacting detail what each tier could wear, eat, and own. For example, only women of the imperial family were permitted silk robes with 5 layers. Ladies-in-waiting made do with 4 layers, while townswomen were limited to cotton. These rigid rules ensured women knew their place and seldom attempted to reach beyond it. Still, each class had its particular hardships and hazards. Peasant women, as we've seen, faced lives of punishing drudgery in the fields. Merchant wives were somewhat better off materially, but were still largely confined to the domestic sphere, assisting their husbands, businesses from behind the scenes, even the relative comfort enjoyed by samurai and noble women came at the steep cost of freedom. For the daughters of the warrior class, a certain degree of education was permitted, even expected. Most samurai girls learned to read and write, usually tutored at home. Some were even trained in self-defense to protect the household when their menfolk were away at war. A lucky few, like Lady Murasaki, even had the opportunity to let their intellectual talents flourish. But such privileges were counterbalanced by the rigid behavioral constraints put upon upper-class women. Noble women in particular led sheltered, circumscribed lives, rarely permitted to leave their gilded cages. The performance of propriety when they did venture out, such as to attend a temple ceremony or wedding, they would be cloaked beneath many layers of sumptuous kimono, their faces hidden behind elaborate screens. Etiquette was everything for a well-born lady. From a young age, girls were rigorously drilled in the arts of calligraphy, poetry, music, and in sense appreciation. A premium was placed on elegance, erudition, and absolute discretion. Even the way a noble woman walked was prescribed. Small shuffling steps, eyes downcast, a practiced stance of docile subservience. While peasant women's value lay in their ability to bear children and work ceaselessly, noble women's currency was their purity, fertility, and unimpeachable reputation. Even a whisper of scandal could irreparably tarnish a high-ranking lady's standing in marriage prospects. Reputational damage could taint her entire family's status by association. Thus, the cultivation of impeccable deportment and untarnished virtue was paramount for women of the ruling class. They may have had more creature comforts than their lower class counterparts, but the fetters of propriety and pedigree bound them just as tightly. Yet, even in this rigidly hierarchical world, there were rare women who managed to transcend the limitations placed on their gender to wield real power and influence. These exceptional ladies, whether by accident of birth, force of personality, or sheer grit and guile, carved out spaces for themselves in the nearly exclusively male enclaves of government and warfare. One such formidable figure was Lady Seiko, born around 1157 into a powerful samurai clan. A marriage of vendetta at 13, Seiko was married off to a rising warlord. But this was no ordinary political match. Seiko's father had been a rival of her new husband, a vendetta that ended with the bride's male relatives being executed and the clan subjugated. The marriage was likely intended to neutralize the threat of retaliation. But Seiko was no meek pawn content to accept her family's defeat. From the start, she used her brilliance and nerve to turn the tables on the husband who had vanquished her kin. Seiko quickly proved herself an indispensable advisor as he worked to consolidate power. Her political acumen and samurai pedigree equipped her to be a savvy strategist and administrator. As his confidant and co-conspirator, she helped him overthrow the ruling clan to become the supreme military dictator of Japan, the first shogun. He clearly respected his wife as a force to be reckoned with. He is said to have called her his other self. Some of his top generals even complained about the disproportionate sway Seiko seemed to hold over the mighty warlord. But Seiko was just getting started. When her husband died unexpectedly, she sprang into action to protect her clan's position. In a bold power play, Seiko had her father appointed regent to her son, the child shogun, making her family the de facto rulers behind the throne. For the next 20 years, Seiko was the power behind the shogunate, masterminding her clan's dominance. While she was compelled to rule through male figureheads, there was no mistaking that Seiko was truly pulling the strings. She had secured her place in the very upper echelons of feudal power, virtually unheard of for a woman of the age. Ambition and tragedy. Seiko's fierce ambition and tenacity in the face of adversity was extraordinary. That a teenage bride from a defeated family could end up in a position to dictate the affairs of the shogunate speaks to her keen intelligence, political cunning, and sheer force of will. While she could not escape all of the usual limitations and indignities visited upon women, she pushed their boundaries further than most could dream. But Seiko and her ilk were the exceptions that proved the rule in feudal Japan. For the overwhelming majority of women, their lives and identities were subsumed by their roles as wives and mothers, with precious little autonomy or self-determination afforded to them. Even a woman's experience of pregnancy and childbirth, her most elemental biological function, was rigidly controlled by the mores and superstitions of the era. Menstruating women were considered ritually unclean, their blood thought to be dangerously polluting. During their monthly cycles, women were often confined to separate quarters and barred from preparing food or entering sacred spaces. This stigma extended to childbirth as well. Birthing huts were set up away from the main house for women to deliver their babies. These birthing huts were often dark, poorly ventilated spaces, a reflection of the perceived taint of the process. After the birth, the new mother would need to stay in seclusion for a period of days or weeks until she was considered cleansed. Only then could she return to the bosom of her family with her newborn. This isolation during such a vulnerable time, sequestered as if diseased, speaks volumes about the abiding unease around the fundamental female capacity to create new life. These entrenched taboos around the mysteries of womanhood, seen as simultaneously essential and unsettling, shaped societal attitudes for centuries. The long shadow of tradition, even as the feudal era gave way to the more modern period in the late 19th century, these deep-rooted stigmas persisted. Even some laws, while ostensibly a modernizing move, still enshrined many of the old iniquities and patriarchal structures. up until the mid-20th century. Many temples and certain venues still banned women due to menstrual taboos. Some shrines had designated spots where women could stand to watch festivals, careful not to enter sacred grounds. These enduring pockets of gender discrimination, holdovers from the feudal past, underscored just how rigid and deep-seated attitudes about women's inherent inferiority were in Japanese culture. For all the seismic social shifts of the late 1800s, true female emancipation would prove to be a slow, incremental battle against centuries of oppressive tradition. But even in the medieval era, some women were striving mightily against their prescribed roles, carving out unlikely niches for themselves on the margins of this male-dominated society, one realm where women could occasionally wield some measure of influence, and independence was perhaps surprisingly within religious orders. Buddhism had been introduced to Japan in the 6th century and steadily gained traction in the ensuing centuries. By the feudal era, it was firmly established as one of the country's major faiths alongside the indigenous religion of Shintoism. These belief systems would intertwine to deeply influence Japanese culture and daily life. For women in particular, Buddhism offered some rare avenues for education, leadership, and spiritual authority denied to them in secular society. Noble women were known to take vows as nuns, sometimes in widowhood, or as a way to escape the confines of arranged marriages, the sanctuary of faith inside convents and monasteries. These women would be freed from their usual domestic duties to immerse themselves in scripture, meditation, and ascetic practices. Some even had opportunities to travel on pilgrimages to holy sites or study under eminent monks. Religion provided a sliver of space for women to exist outside of their relationships to men as wives, mothers, and daughters. One temple stands as a potent symbol of this phenomenon. Founded in 745 by an empress, this temple was established to pray for the soul of the empress's deceased mother. The temple housed both nuns and monks in its sprawling grounds, with women serving as abbesses and administrators. For centuries, it was a thriving center of female Buddhist practice and scholarship. Court ladies and noble women from across Japan's provinces would flock there to take religious vows and immerse themselves in clerical life. The convent was renowned for its beautiful gardens, tranquil atmosphere, and the erudition of its nuns. It stands as a testament to the indomitable will of women determined to find avenues for learning and contemplation in a world that sought to constrain them to the domestic sphere. It speaks to the thirst for knowledge and self-actualization that simmered beneath the placid surface of even the most privileged women's lives. The Shadow Warrior's Lady Chiyome was a remarkable woman who defied convention in feudal Japan. Born into an influential clan, Chiyome lost her samurai husband in battle in 1560. Newly widowed in her mid-20s, Chiyome could have retreated into the expected life of a grieving noblewoman. But instead, she approached her uncle, a powerful warlord. With a daring proposition, Chiyome had a vision of a new kind of fighting force. An all-female group of operatives specially trained in espionage, sabotage, and intelligence gathering. In the male-dominated world of samurai warfare, it was almost unthinkable. But her uncle saw the potential in his niece's idea and tasked her with making it a reality. So Chiyome set to work building her network of female operatives. She recruited girls and young women who had been orphaned, widowed, or cast out by their families, those on the margins of society who had little to lose. Chiyome offered them a new purpose and a way to survive in a harsh world. At Chiyome's hidden training camps in the mountains, the women learned the arts of stealth, disguise, and infiltration. They were taught to blend in seamlessly with any level of society, from the lowest peasants to the wealthiest nobility. Chiyome drilled them in martial arts, teaching them to wield daggers and deliver strategic strikes. Perhaps most importantly, She trained them to use their wits and feminine wiles to manipulate men and extract vital secrets. Before long, Chaeom had assembled a formidable force of some 200 to 300 operatives, fiercely loyal to her and her uncle's clan. She dispatched them on missions deep into enemy territory, where they could move about freely in guises as unassuming as maids, entertainers, or priestesses.